Greetings from the Brandenburg shed here in Flat Creek Road in Black Mountain, North Carolina. The children have exiled me to the shed, but it's okay. There's peace in the family, and there's now peace in the world. In World Civ, we're looking at the post-war era from roughly 1945 to around 1991, and we'll look at the world made new here in week 13. We're closing in on the last half of the 20th century. This week we'll look at the post-war order. Next week we'll look at the decolonizing world, or independence movements in Africa and Southeast Asia and the former Soviet Union. Week 15 we'll look at the year 1989 and the world that came after that, and we'll close in week 16 where we'll look at the world we live in today. We'll look at the world post-pandemic, and we'll look at different models of leadership coming out of Germany, the United States, and in China. This is also Easter week, so I want to wish you a happy Easter. This is the most important day in the Christian calendar. This is our Christmas in many ways. I'm certainly looking forward to celebrating with my family, ending a Lenten fast, and probably watching a service on the internet. And I hope you are finding ways to connect with people you love dearly during this time. The image you see here is of the Last Supper, Michelangelo's The Last Supper, except it's not quite that. This came across the internet recently. This is Jesus in a Zoom meeting with the 12 disciples. So we have faith and hope that he is with us today, even during these difficult times. All right, so let's jump into the lecture. This lecture is divided into 5 parts. We'll look at the world in 1945, the aftermath of World War II. Then we'll look at all these institutions that the United States helps to birth. And your source document reading is FDR's The Four Freedoms. After that, we'll look at the American century, sort of this world America made, global culture. We'll have some fun with that. After that, we'll look at the way the world received American culture, the ways the world received this American consumer model. Your source document reading here is the French Coca-Cola ban, which is very exciting. And finally, we'll look at the Cold War system, the struggle and the big picture perspective between the United States and its allies and the Soviet Union and its sphere. All right. I'm going to start with looking at the world in 1945. Obviously, there were celebrations in the Western world, indeed the entire world at the war's end in Europe and in Japan. But the war had been an absolute cataclysmic horror. There were between 50 and 70 million deaths during the war. How do we get to those numbers? How do we get to those incredibly horrific numbers? We get to those numbers through the obvious battlefield deaths. Here we see an image of Stalingrad in the Soviet Union. About 900,000 German dead, over 1.3 million Russian dead. So 2 million dead in just one battle, one vicious battle, a city destroyed. But this was a total war, right? A lot of soldiers died, including 450,000 US GIs. We get to this number of between 50 and 70 million dead through the Holocaust, right? Which we looked at last week. But there the numbers between 6 and 7.5 million dead Jews, Roma peoples, and other German quote-unquote undesirables. We get to that horrific number through civilian deaths, right? Um, Between 20 and 25 million civilians died during the battle. Many during the war. Many died through this new era of incredibly vicious bombardment from the air. Of course, the NSDAP, right? The Nazis began this process first in Spain in 1936, but then by attacking England in 1940. Above, you can see a cathedral destroyed in Coventry, England. This was a galvanizing force for the British people, right? As they would eventually push back the German Luftwaffe. But now we have civilians fearing for death from the skies. As the war neared its end, German cities and Japanese cities were also bombed. Uh, Famously, the cities of Cologne, pictured here in utter destruction, and the cities of Hamburg. More people probably died in these fire bombings than probably died in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Of course, here we have a slide of this. In many ways, great tragedy. Um, these bombings conducted by the United States on two cities in Japan forced Japan to surrender. Also brought in great moral and ethical questions about the nature of war that were really quite vociferous in 1945. But these debates melted away as the world rejoiced that the war in Europe and Japan had ended. As the war drew to a close, America really had such a preponderance of power in 1945. The U.S. stood at this moment at the summit of the world. Just to give you a sense of where America's at, the United States has one half of the world's productive capacity in 1945. It has two-thirds of the world's gold reserves. Hello, Knoxville. One half of the monetary reserves. It has twice as much petroleum or oil as the rest of the world combined. It has a monopoly on aerospace and electronics. It's got a short-term monopoly on the atomic bomb. Uh, and this is in contrast with the rest of the world, which is very much destroyed. So, what does the United States do with this sort of preponderance of power? The post-war era is often remembered as a period of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, and we'll get to that story. But I want to focus here on, in many ways, the world America made after 1945. Now, this is a world that America is not acting alone, it's acting with allies. People are agents, countries are agents in this process. But this is very much a world that is formed and created by the United States. Um, so, what kind of world does America create? What's this international order? And what are the origins of this world? Um, First, I want to look at Franklin Delano Roosevelt speech in 1941. It was a State of the Union speech, but it is more commonly known as the Four Freedoms speech. In this speech, as the United States is not yet drawn into the war, he's really recasting Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, which a generation earlier, Woodrow Wilson had attempted but failed to reform the world in America's image. But here he's using a lot of the ideas from Woodrow Wilson and recasting a speech on January 6, 1941, where FDR proposes four fundamental freedoms that people everywhere in the world, he said, ought to enjoy. The first was freedom of speech. The second, freedom of worship. The third, freedom from want. The fourth, freedom from fear. Now, these four freedoms were everywhere in the 1940s, everywhere in the American war effort, from Hollywood celebrities like Ava Gardner doing PSAs for freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear, On the left of the slide, you can see Norman Rockwell's incredibly iconic 1943 Saturday Night Post paintings depicting these images. Perhaps you've seen this before. In the poster era, these were often in homes, in dinner tables, the walls of dinner tables, living rooms, and so forth. But this was sort of the idea. America was going to go into this war with an idea to recast the world in its. Now, how does this become a reality? It becomes a reality in part in 1941. So this is before December 7th, 1941, before the bombings at Pearl Harbor. Earlier that year, FDR and the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill meet off the coast in Canada. A very secretive, very dangerous meeting. But together, they sign a document called the Atlantic Charter, which agrees that they want to create a world in which all people will have the right to self-determination. Next week, we'll look at the ways dozens and dozens of countries take up this call and do just that. They wanted trade barriers to be lowered. There's to be global economic cooperation and advancement of social welfare. They wanted to create a world free of want and fear. They wanted the world to have freedom of the seas. They wanted global disarmament. So this is the world America wants to create. In a certain sense, some scholars have argued that this was America's New Deal for the world. It happens in 1944. This slide is for you business majors. In 1944, U.S. leaders believe a new era of peace would prove empty without a market-oriented system of global trade and finance. So they meet in Bretton Woods. And to me, this is a great shame because they almost met at the Grove Park Inn in Asheville, North Carolina. Nonetheless, they meet up in New England at a conference where they launch institutions known as the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. Basically, they establish global free trade norms. In this process, New York City becomes the financial center of the world. The U.S. dollar becomes the world's preeminent global currency, and together they basically promote financial stability by these institutions sort of help countries keep their international accounts solvent. The IMF, the World Bank, they make loans. And these institutions are still with us. And these are institutions that are currently involved in, trying to make sure that the world doesn't fall into a global recession in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic. In 1945, the United States also rebuilds much of the world. After Japan's defeat, the United States actually rules the country. Japan is occupied by U.S. forces. General MacArthur runs that nation for around 7 years. And there's somewhat of an irony here because the Japanese and their imperialist rays had attempted to exert control over East Asia in what they termed a co-prosperity sphere. You can see this image on the left here with happy Korean and Chinese peoples celebrating Japan's rule, when of course the picture was very, very different. We have to just look at the rape of Nanking in 1937 to remember the ways the Japanese killed and tortured and used other Asian peoples. But in 1945, the United States has a choice. They choose to kind of bring back Japan, and they remake Japan in many ways in America's image. The Emperor of Japan is pardoned from any crimes of war, even though the evidence is perhaps not leading that direction. This, of course, is an incredibly wise move, as there is no counterinsurgency campaign in Japan in the way you saw in Iraq in 2004 and 5, for example. Some of the top leaders are tried in Japan, but for the most part, Japan is brought into slowly turned into a democracy that is very business forward, a democracy that some people called Japan Inc., a world run by huge corporations, including ones that you're familiar with, like Sony, Nintendo, and so forth. The US also rebuilds Germany. And Germany is really quite fascinating because during the war, Germany had been viewed as this certain kind of Übermensch, where this incredible blitzkrieging war machine that could run over nearly any opponent in just a few weeks. And when the fighting had ended in 1945, there's millions of American soldiers and administrators in occupied Germany. And there's a really quick turnaround from seeing Germany as this fierce enemy to Germany as a very close friend. In this slide, you can see on the left images from a film, actually, of American soldiers trying to connect with some lovely German Fräulein. This caused concern for the United States Army. They put out images, as you can see on the slide, telling them not to fraternize with the enemy, showing them images of what the Germans had done, terrible killings and the Holocaust and so forth. But as GIs were in Germany in 1945, in the summer and fall, there weren't a lot of German men. Many of them had died, others were maimed, millions of them were in prison camps in the Iron Curtain in the Soviet Union. Was left with the weak, the frail, and many, many German women that looked very similar to American women. So these GIs tried to do what they could to get with them. Some of them, of course, were married off. A third of the U.S. soccer team is a descendant from this story in many ways, the U.S. national soccer team. But almost overnight, Germany becomes this nation that is not this masculine nation, but this feminine nation that is weak, that needs America's protection and care. In many ways, it was this enemy that became an ally, perhaps almost too. Now, in the aftermath of World War II, Europe was in tough shape, right? Dozens and dozens of cities were utterly destroyed. The winter of 1946-47 was an incredibly cold and horrible winter. People are worried about starvation in Europe. So the United States hatches a plan. They want to make sure that Europe doesn't turn communist. So they hatch a plan called the Marshall Plan, named after General Marshall and current Secretary of State of President Harry Truman in the United States. The Marshall Plan sent $22 billion of aid, with the bulk of it going to France, West Germany, Italy, and Britain from 1947 to 1952. It really helps kickstart the economies. It eases starvation and privation. But there's a catch. 70% of the money goes to U.S. contracts. So all these Europeans are buying Levi's and Coca-Cola, and these cities are being rebuilt with American contractors. The money is also open to the Soviet Union and to states that are becoming communist states in Eastern Europe, but the Russians don't let them take that money. Was this a capitalist conspiracy? Some have argued, but in many ways, this was more of an empire by invitation. The U.S. policy in Europe was actually bold and flexible, and it really let European nations kind of decide how they wanted to create their economies and their governments. And in this whole process, you can see that there's a number of institutions that are birthed in making the world order new in 1945. To start off, coming out of the Marshall Plan, we have the European Union being formed. Right? When all these countries are negotiating with the United States about aid, it's bringing them closer together. And and even when the Marshall Plan is over, these European nations continue to have these discussions. So in 1952, French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman creates the European Coal and Steel Community. This turns in 1957 to the European Economic Community. By 1993, you have the European Union being formed, and soon laws are passed where young people can cross borders without having to stop at the border with their passport. Common currency is introduced in 2002. So this institution, which is here, is actually kind of formed in the wake of America's post-war remaking of the world. Another institution is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, commonly referred to as NATO. This was a defense organization where Western European nations allied with the United States, and they all agreed that if one nation attacks them, i.e., the Soviet Union, then all of them will come to their defense. This was Article 5 of the NATO articles. And it should be said that to this day, if, let's say, let me pick on a random country, Senegal. Sorry, Senegal. You're wonderful at soccer. You're a wonderful nation. If Senegal were to attack, say, Luxembourg, right, the United States would be duty bound to declare war on Senegal and defend Luxembourg. Another institution that is formed is the United Nations. Now, I find this really fascinating because in American popular culture, especially among more conservative folks, there's a lot of distrust of the United Nations. There's a lot of rhetoric about anti-American sentiment coming out of the United Nations. There's sentiment about it taking away American sovereignty and so forth. And I'm empathetic to the way people perceive that. But it has to be said that historically, the United Nations was birthed by the United States. Its name was created by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The meetings are taking place in San Francisco. Here you can see a lovely plant garden. San Francisco welcomes the United Nations. The United States provides most of the seed money for this. And as part of this course, you should know what the United Nations does. The United Nations is an organization that has two bodies. The first is the Security Council. The Security Council consists of 5 states: the United States, the USSR, now Russia, France, Britain, and China. At the time this was formed, China was a struggling republic, so not yet communist. Russia was an ally of the Allies. And there's also a rotating group of 6 other states that were part of the Security Council. These folks conduct matters of war and peace. And then there is the second body, which is the General Assembly, the GA. They conduct non-binding business on economic and social matters. People have a lot of hope in the United Nations. Right here you can see some branding from them. The United Nations fights for freedom, and we want to build a world for understanding, for peace. And over the post-war era, the UN has as it's known as like the Blue Helmets, have been participants as peacekeeping forces in hotspot areas around the world, from India to Israel to Kosovo to Cyprus to Ivory Coast to South Sudan, etc., etc. And the UN also is the umbrella for many different organizations. Here on the slide, you can see around a dozen of them. I want to highlight just a few of them. One of them is UNESCO on the bottom here. UNESCO is the organization that makes sure that the world's heritage sites, think the Statue of Liberty, think the Liberty Bell, think the pyramids, and so forth, are protected in times of war. When there's often disasters around the world, floods and famines and so forth, on TV you might ask for donations to UNICEF, which is the Child Relief Organization. UNHCR is the refugee agency that is helping a lot of folks in the midst of the Syrian civil war in the Middle East. What else here? Oh, the World Health Organization, right? These are the folks that are attempting to handle the global pandemic, right? So these organizations, many of which are headquartered in New York, in The Hague, in Europe, are ones that the United States helps to found in the aftermath of World War II. Another institution is actually sort of international law, which has a long history going back to the 1800s, but it really takes form at the Nuremberg trials. In 1946, Supreme Court Justice Arthur Vandenberg goes to Nuremberg, the site where the Germans conducted many marches and parades during the Nazi era, and they put leading German NSDAP or Nazi leaders on trial for, quote, crimes against humanity. That is, in fact, where that term was originated. You can see in this image that they're all wearing earphones. These earphones were a project from the company IBM, where each individual was wearing these earphones, and in the back there's a room of translators who could simultaneously translate the proceedings for everyone in that midst. In 1948, the UN puts together a document called UDHR, or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Eleanor Roosevelt, the widow of former President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, is the chair of a panel that brings together really probably the most significant document on human rights in the world. It gives social and political protections to the individuals living in countries who abided by this declaration. It was in many ways a very Christian document with the foundation of human dignity. A Lebanese Christian named Charles Malik and René Cassin, a French Jewish survivor of the Holocaust, helped draft this document. And this becomes a thorn in the side for the Soviet Union, especially in the 1970s, as many Soviet citizens are demanding that their government abide to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And there's in many ways, a very small part that the Monterey College played in this. In March of 1945, Eleanor Roosevelt, then still the First Lady, actually arrived in Monterey. Her trip to Black Mountain was hosted by the Council for Southern Mountain Workers. It was kind of part of a meet and greet in different areas of the United States. So she had a number of meetings around Western Carolina in those days. But she flew by Monterey College. She gave a brief chapel talk, convocation talk. She was greeted by President Anderson. Some of you were until recently living in Anderson dorms. She was greeted by Dean Margaret Spencer and 400 adoring women undergraduates. Her chapel address was spoken off the cuff and was not transcribed, but the dialect, a student newspaper, covered the special convocation. In 15 brief minutes, Mr. Roosevelt addressed this beautiful country, describing, quote, the charming lake in the springtime. Getting to the heart of the matter, she described Montreat as a, quote, mountain sanctuary, a safe space for future women leaders to focus on their studies in a time of global crisis. Perhaps that's where this class springs forth. She actually closed by thanking the community for housing families of the German and Japanese diplomats before they returned to their native lands. You see, in 1942-43, the Montreat community actually hosted German and Japanese diplomats and important business people that were detained by the United States government lest they conduct as agents of enemy nations. They were treated relatively well. They're housed in the Assembly Inn across from Lake Susan. Here you can see some Germans talking to each other. In this next slide, you can see Eleanor Roosevelt with the president, Dean Margaret Spencer, another faculty member, and students of Montreat College as they exited Graham Chapel. So Montreat is sort of part of this larger story of helping form Eleanor Roosevelt and her vision of global human rights. All right. So there is a question of whether all these institutions still matter, and are they still relevant? Well, of course they are. They still exist. They still have a lot of power and a lot of purchase. But we are living a time between that these institutions are under pressure, right? The wars in the Middle East have very much reduced America's goodwill, especially in the Middle East, but in some ways around the world. And some of the world is turning their backs on this sense of 1945 internationalism. A few years ago in England, they voted to leave the European Union in a move called Brexit. And in 2016, President Donald Trump was elected. He was elected in part on a platform that sought to have America first, and that looked to kind of move away from many of these international institutions. We'll see what the 2020 pandemic does, whether it strengthens or whether it attacks these post-war institutions. All right, so I want to shift. So as I said, I want to shift to talk about the American century. I want to talk about the United States in the post-war era and the culture, the global culture they helped create. The author of the term the American century was a publisher, a former missionary kid from China, Henry Luce, who would publish Time magazine, Life magazine, Sports Illustrated, Good Housekeeping, Fortune, etc., etc. He's simply known as the publisher in many ways. But in early 1941, before America had entered the war after Pearl Harbor, in the middle of Life magazine, which was filled with stories about B-list Hollywood celebrities, yachts in the Caribbean, new shoes, new cars that had entered the market, he wrote an article titled The American Century. And he said this: the world of the 20th century, if it is to come to life in any visibility of health and vigor, must be to a significant degree an American century. What he was offering the world was a different vision from the racist empire of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. He offered a world filled with abundance, filled with consumer goods. He wanted a world filled with his magazines, right? A world of the good life. And in 1945, Americans were certainly ready to experience the good life. There were certainly wartime restrictions, something that we're no doubt familiar with in our current predicament. Americans were asked to carpool, right? If you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. um, have you really tried to save gas by getting into a car club? Of course, these restrictions weren't limited to just gas, all sorts of things. So when the war's over in 1945 and Americans are celebrating, there really is this moment where they want to spend a lot of their hard-earned savings, and the American government is helping make that happen. They pass a GI Bill, which gives uh, returning soldiers the opportunity to go to school for essentially free. And this is a boom era for colleges and universities across the United States. Um, it helps them get jobs. It helps them give seed money to start businesses. Now, this was technically open to everyone, but there were some restrictions and limitations on who was able to access these goods, and that was limited to mostly white people. Tragically, many of the African American service members were, through bureaucratic pressure, excluded from this bill of goods. A great tragedy in the post war era. And as America sort of begins to spend all their money, this ideology, which is in many ways traced to Henry Luce, emerges, and that's called consumerism, or really American consumerism. This is a way of thinking or an ideology that encourages the acquisition of goods and services. This is, of course, a world that you're very familiar with, but in the post war era, it becomes normal for people of the United States to have formerly very expensive goods that were only uh, obtainable by the very rich, the elites. So this is a world of refrigerators and kitchens, a world of electronics. This is a world of television culture. Um, by the 1960s, uh, by 1960, 87% of Americans own a television, and many of them are owning a TV in their own home. 75% own a washing machine. 75% own a car. Goods are flying off the shelves into single family homes um, in, in the United States. This is a world in which car culture becomes normal in America. Right? Car is a great American symbol identifying freedom and identity. Roads become a staple of American life. Right? Interstate highways are built. This is actually part of national defense. In 1956, President Dwight Eisenhower passes this act where they build I-80 and I-90, taking Americans to the national parks out west. But these are built to get people out of cities. This is good for shipping. This is good for economic integration. Um, in the process, 8 million new cars are produced every year. More people are driving. Americans are becoming a people of the automobile. And where are they going? They're going to something called the suburbs, a relatively new invention, right? Levittown in 1957 is this first planned community just outside of Philadelphia, where former service members could choose one of six model homes to choose, and these were built, well built, but cheaply and quickly built, uh, and many Americans are flocking to suburbs. Who's not going to the suburbs? African Americans. They are largely excluded from this process, and this in turn creates a decline in American cities as jobs with lower as jobs and industries move to the suburbs where there are lower taxes than in the larger intercities. This is a world of fast food, right? A world of the drive-throughs, which are experiencing a bounce once again in our pandemic times. This is a world in which the mall becomes normalized. Although the mall's days may currently be numbered, I believe the last mall was built in 2011 in New Jersey. So we're seeing sort of the end of mall culture with the rise of Amazon and This is a world filled with vacations for the first time. Regular folks, middle class folks can go and take the great American summer vacation, right? This is boom time for shore culture in the East and the West. This is a great period for national parks and for very motels and so forth. One of the negative effects is that you see the beginning of the decline of cities, especially cities in the former industrial belt. Think Cleveland, think Pittsburgh, Detroit, etc., etc. All right. So what happens is that this consumer model goes globally. And one place we can pinpoint the ways it goes global is in 1959 at the World's Fair in Moscow, right? So the World's Fair happens every 4 years. It still happens. And Moscow happened to be hosting it. Now, the Soviet Union was actually doing relatively well in the aftermath of World War II as well. Their economy grew by 5% at a higher rate than even the United States. So they're very proud to have this national exhibition. So all the countries go to the national fair. They have a hall. This is an image from the American Hall. It looks like a golf ball. But in this hall, people stood in line for hours and hours, and they showed a kitchen and cars and TVs. I want to get back to the kitchen. In 1959, the American Vice President, Richard Nixon, future President of the United States, traveled there. And he meets with a gentleman you can see in this image pointing his finger there. That's Nikita Khrushchev, the successor to Joseph Stalin, who had passed away 6 years earlier. And Nikita Khrushchev is telling Nixon, nobody has these kitchens. Nobody drives cars in America. This is all a myth. And Nixon's like, no, we all have kitchens. We all have a dishwasher. We all have dryers. We all have refrigerators. Everyone has this in the capitalist market that America's creating. This is a typical American house, Nixon argued. And for many people living in Europe, this felt, and in Asia, this felt very true. Between 1950 and 1970, GDP, or gross domestic product, rose dramatically. So these consumer goods and this culture life of TVs and cars and new highways and vacations is extended to Europe and to East Asia. So Europe also gets cars and refrigerators, washers, TVs, entertainment, travel, education, better housing, right? They're getting VW bugs. Italy's getting Fiats. Japan is creating radios via Sony. People are flying on vacation through TWA to tour sites around the world. The economy in this 15-year window in the post-war era doubles in France and Britain. It triples in West Germany and in Italy. It goes up 6 times in Japan. So really this amazing time of abundance. This vision that Henry Luth birthed in 1941 goes global. Now, what about the Soviet Union? Their economy actually goes up 5 times, even though they started at a very worse point than the economies of Western Europe. They rejected this, right? Good Soviet workers were not supposed to be drawn to goods that created weak character. Although there was a market for very high-end goods, so ironically, the Soviet Union market was very similar to the United States in, say, the 1890s as to who could buy what. Now, who is attracted to this consumer model? Not, in short, non-elites. Young people drew to this American way of the world, in part to kind of reject the more conservative state culture of their parents. Workers embraced it because for the first time they were getting access to many goods that their bosses had before. Women are also drawn to this world of goods. In many ways, making their lives much easier in the process. Now, who was opposed? Elites. Elites disliked what they viewed as materialistic society. There's a book written by Georges Perec called Things, in which he tells a story of a young French couple that goes to America on their honeymoon, falls in love with the American way of life, goes back to France, starts their life, builds a house, and they start buying things. And they start hoarding things. And before you know it, they can barely walk around their house. They have so many things, and they end up stuck in their house, and they commit suicide. This is a very dark tale of consumerism. Right? Bertrand Russell, a British intellectual, said this: aesthetic standards, except in architecture, will probably be lowered. There will be less respect for art and learning and more for the forceful executive. Elites did not like the changes that the American good life brought forward necessarily. And there's a famous story, which is one of your source documents for this week. More and more people talked about this as the world becoming more and more Americanized. Is this consumer culture, is this just one way of the Americanization of the world? Here you can see, and no single product exemplified this more than Coca-Cola, right? Founded in 1880 in Atlanta, soon went to Canada and to Mexico, goes to Europe, kind of spreads across the world. It was actually big in Nazi Germany in the 1930s. But this was sort of a symbol of American culture, the American way of life. And in 1949, in France, people began to call this coca colonization. American culture is beginning to dominate our way of life. And in France, producers of wine and mineral water, right, both popular industries in France, called Coca-Cola a poison. The French Communist Party, very small, but they launched a polemic against Coke as the leading edge of U.S. invasion. The French Finance Ministry and the government side says Coke profits will send our local economy down the drain. And they began to say things like, the U.S. began to push back, saying things like Coca-Cola was not injurious to the health of Americans who liberated France from the Nazis. So what happens? Coke is banned in France by the parliament. But in the long term, the children complained, and the parents of those children listened. Coke wins the battle in the early 1950s. Coke once more can be had in Paris. Drink away. But this sort of sense of the world and globalized culture being very American still is around, right? Here you can see an image of Jean Baudrillard, a very famous French post-structuralist critic, a postmodern thinker. He said this about the United States: America is the original version of modernity. We are all the dubbed or subtitled version. Right? We're just a second-rate copy. So is he right? I'm sure at times he is. But there's a way of looking at the way culture transfers, and that's as one of domestication. This is different from Americanization, kind of an imperialist American culture dominating the world. Domestication is a process by which imported products and practices have always been subject to transformation in order to become assimilated to daily life in a new cultural context with its own unique character. So in other words, American culture isn't just thrown onto people. People use American culture for their own means and to their own ends and into their own ways. It's a lot more complicated than we make it out to be. So here you can see some images of James Dean. All right, I want to sort of talk about how domestication works. In Italy, in the aftermath of the war, the economy is ruined, And Italy is one of the nations that gets Marshall Plan money. Italy does many things. They're great at food. They're great at building cars, right? Fiat, Ferrari. But Italy, along with Paris and New York, are the fashion centers of the world, especially in Milan. So one of these Milanese fashion companies gets some seed money from the Marshall Plan, and they use it to fly to the United States, where they meet celebrities. Think Jackie Bouvier, the future Mrs. JFK. They meet Ava Gardner. They meet James Dean, the coolest man in America, right? A great upcoming actor. So these Italian fashion folks go to James Dean and say, "Hey, James Dean, what do you like to wear?" He's like, "I like to wear jeans and a t-shirt, nothing else." And they say, "Okay, can we make you really high-end jeans and a t-shirt?" He says, "Yeah, I'd love that." So these designers go back to Milan. They produce high-end jeans, really nice t-shirts, and James Dean and other American celebrities start wearing jeans and a t-shirt. And it's at this precise moment that in America and in the rest of the world, people start wearing jeans and t-shirts. Have you ever looked at pictures in like the 1920s, 30s, 1890s? Everyone, even the poor, are wearing suits everywhere, right? Like global fashion changes. And this is not just a one-way street, right? People are using American culture and American money for their own ends. Okay? So I would argue that when you look at global culture, it's a more complicated matter. It's not just the Americanization of the world. A lot of culture is domesticated, right? So on this slide, you can see images from a biker in southern China, right? Copying that James Dean look for his own purposes. If you travel around the world, you may hopefully eat local food, but you may have noticed that McDonald's is different, right? In Germany and France, they serve beer at McDonald's. In Indonesia, they serve rice and baba yam. In India, they don't serve as much meat for religious reasons, right? American TV shows like American Idol are huge in places like Bhutan. Even cinema changes, right? The French cinematic tradition is very proud, um, but even they have to sort of adapt to American culture and change it for their own way. So here you see Jean Jardin, a very famous French actor, in a series of films called OSS. Uh, this is sort of like he's like a French super spy. It's like part James Bond, part Austin Powers, but they're using it for their ends to make money in France. All right. So what happens in this American century is that this U.S. way of life, the good life, models admiration and emulation. This idea of the good life goes global. America begins to protect its power based on a very positive appeal. And sometimes America's increasing global commitment gets itself stuck in far-flung commitments, right? Think of Vietnam, for example. Uh, the image on the slide is of Coca-Cola in Saigon. And eventually, these commitments push America to become a global policeman. So I hope we think critically about the ways kind of, culture is also part of world history. And the world culture um, is not just an American one. All right. In the last part of this lecture, I want to set up the Cold War system. And I want to move relatively quickly here. So I just want to give you a big picture perspective. From 1945-46 to 1989 or 1981, the United States and the Soviet Union are stuck in a bitter struggle. And the world is divided into these different camps. So the so-called first world, or the free world, is the United States, Western Europe, and its allies, Japan, Australia, and so forth. The second world is the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, Eastern Europe. And then we have the third world, which is the often known as the non-aligned world, but this was much of South America, much of Africa, much of the Middle East and Southeast Asia. They wanted to try to keep the distance between America and the Soviet Union. And this was a very difficult thing to do because both the Soviet Union and the United States offered a version of what it meant to be modern. Um, there was really two different versions of what it meant to be a modern person. For the Soviets, this was the working class, the world uniting a workers' paradise, rights for everyone. In the United States, this was a vision of the good life. Everyone has their own home, private property, a free market economy, prosperity for everyone, freedoms for everyone. And they both had their own worries. For the Soviets, they wanted to make sure that Russia was not invaded again, as it had been by Germany and earlier by France. They wanted to reject capitalism. They wanted to protect their revolutionary goals and promote fellow communist states. And they thought that the United States was always trying to reach its hand on and close in on their circle. For Americans, their goals were to limit communist expansion, limit the bear, right? Limit the Russian bear. They wanted to expand free markets, build peace through prosperity, expand more and more rights and freedoms for more people. And they viewed Russia as trying to push back against these goals. So how does this Cold War start? It starts, I would say, in 1946, when an American diplomat from Wisconsin named George Kennan wrote a long telegram, 8,000 words long, in which he said that Russia was always seeking advancement. They were paranoid. The best thing America could do was to avoid war with Russia. That would be like World War III. We wouldn't want that. But the best thing to do is to contain the Soviet Union by propping up states that are under pressure from the communist power. Winston Churchill, the former World War II leader of England, echoed these sentiments when he traveled to America in March 1946. He spoke at a small college in the Midwest, and he gave what he called the Iron Curtain speech. From the Trieste and the Adriatic all the way down to the Mediterranean, he said an Iron Curtain is covering Eastern Europe. Think Poland, think Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, etc. There are no more freedoms there, he said. And a year later, in March of 1947, the American president, Harry Truman, put forward the Truman Doctrine, which essentially said the United States will send aid and money to any foe under pressure from communism, in this case, Greece and Turkey. This went hand in hand with the Marshall Plan in 1947, which gave money to Western European powers that supported the United States. And as America is building this containment policy, they agreed to create the state of West Germany in 1948, which the Russians were not a fan of. This is essentially divided Germany between the Russian sections and the pro-West sections in the West. Tensions rose highly here in the capital of Berlin, which was dominated by the Soviet Union. They blocked off Western powers. The Western powers sent so-called candy bombers in over the summer of 1948 to 1949. So by this period, there really is an intense rivalry with the Soviet Union. America responds by birthing NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a common defense pact that went into effect in April 1949. But the Soviets responded. That same year, they acquired the atomic bomb, really a shock to the American political establishment, thus assuring that that the Cold War would remain essentially a standstill. In 1949, the communists were victorious in China. There was a long civil war in China. China watchers knew that this was coming, but this was really a shock to America, and actually a shock to the Monterey community, as around a dozen missionaries were expelled that same year and had to return back to this community, which housed many, many missionaries in the mid-century period. The Soviets created their own version of NATO. It's called the Warsaw Pact. So these were Eastern European nations that were communist, often forced to be communist, but they were communist. They got aid from the Soviet Union. They also agreed to protect each other in a military alliance. So the Cold War is hot at this time. So one of your source document readings are these stories from the Iron Curtain, which showcase how difficult life was within Eastern Europe. Now, I'm going to fly through in about 3 minutes a number of hot points during this Cold War. We're not going to go in the weeds on this. I just want to give you a big picture perspective of these tension points, these hot points. And we'll look at the First World first. Tensions of the First World were centered in Germany. In 1961, the Soviets built a Berlin Wall. Here you can see an image of the Brandenburg Gate. Hey, that's mine. Where they would not let any more German subjects escape to the West. So evident, it was becoming very evident that life in West Berlin and West Germany were better than in the communist system. Hundreds of people died trying to cross the Berlin Wall. These tensions resumed in as late as 1983, where America was conducting a military exercise known as Able Archer. Soviets misinterpreted this campaign, and there were heightened nuclear tensions in the Ronald Reagan era that thankfully subdued. In the Second World War, in the Soviet sphere, there were also huge internal problems. In 1956, in Hungary, citizens, especially students, protested for more rights and for open and fair elections. In response, the Soviets sent in the tanks and massacred many of the protesters. That same experience would repeat itself in Czechoslovakia in 1968. And even within the Soviet Union, tensions were growing. The Chinese Communist State, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, who we will discuss next week, believed the Soviets were too lax in their communism. There's actually a very brief border war, relatively minor, but it shows the extent to which different visions of what it meant to be good communist flourished, whether it was in Vietnam or in China or in the Soviet Union. The Soviets famously tried to invade and prop up a communist regime in Afghanistan in 1979, which failed dramatically. There are also tensions in China. In 1989, hundreds of, in fact, tens of thousands of students pushed for democracy as the Iron Curtain began to crumble in the East. In this case, these protests were quelled by the government. To this day, if you read Chinese history textbooks in Beijing, these students are not learning about the students who pushed for democracy in Beijing in 1989. But in the Third World, the disasters were the most. Millions died in the Korean War in 1950 to 1953, in the process establishing the now pariah state of North Korea, this hermit kingdom. Instability reigned in Central America. In the nation of Guatemala, for example, a center leftist named Arbenz was elected as president, and big um, produce company known as Dole and Chiquita, as they're known as today, pressured the CIA to overthrow this person, which they did. They installed a strongman, but the aftermath was decades and decades of conflict and civil war, where up to 400,000 people were killed in Guatemala alone. Right, there are tension points in Cuba, which in 1962 there was a Cuban Missile Crisis, which threatened the world as we know it. Thankfully, President John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev were able to bring this nuclear tension to a peaceful resolution, in many ways ending the Cold War, even though it went on and on and on. One ways it kept going on was America's involvement in Vietnam. Again, millions of dead people, 50,000 dead GIs, but this was really a disaster in Indochina. There were other conflicts in Africa, as African nations were funneled with money from the United States and from the Soviet Union. So while the Cold War was probably a good thing for Europe, peace reigned there, it may have been relatively prudent in the Middle East and the global South, or in the third world, it was an epic disaster. Here on a final slide, you can see the numbers killed in this post-war era. So I'm going to conclude this lecture by as I said, I want to conclude this lecture by kind of reflecting on Holy Week. We look towards a better world, a world to come. We have hope that Christ will make all things new, create a new heavens and a new earth. In the meantime, we can pray and work for peace and justice, and think critically about the post-war world that the United States helped birth, for better and for worse. Till next week, happy Easter.